Thank you very much for joining us tonight, and welcome here to Dearborn Public Library. We'll be talking with author Celia Voss. We'll, we'll be talking with author Laurie Gwen Shapiro about a wonderful new book, The Aviator the Showman, Amelia Earhart, George Putnam, and the Marriage That Made an American Icon shortly. In the meantime, I just have some quick announcements. Ms. Shapiro was quite kind enough to sign a number of bookmarks. So I've already passed out one tonight to a person who picked up the book. Like to pass out more, just contact me here at the library, and I'll be glad to drop it in the mail, or if you want to drop by, I'll hand it off to you. And tonight, there'll be some program evaluations, both here in the auditorium and online. If you want to fill them out, great. That'll help us out with information for next programs. And just a quick couple of quick headlines for a couple upcoming programs. So we have Caitlin Clark, the book on Caitlin Clark by Christine Brennan, coming up in September. Got another program, Making the Sunset Boulevard movie, also in September and October. We have the CIA book club about bringing books behind the Iron Curtain in October, and we'll be talking with the historian Rick Atkinson on his new book on American Revolution in December. So check our events page. I have all event information there. So Ms. Shapiro is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, journalist who's writing has appeared in New Yorker, New York Times, New York Magazine, The Daily Beast, Slate, and others. She's the author of The Stowaway, which that you probably talk about that in a bit as to how you came up with the idea for this book. And she's also the adjunct professor at New York University's Journalism Institute. So thank you very much, Laurie, for joining us tonight.
I'm thrilled to be with you. This is my only virtual event, so this is really quite thrilling. I've been on the road, and I go back out again tomorrow.
Well, yeah, I looked at your roster of events, and wow, it's quite something.
Well, I think it's partly the book is, got excerpted in the Yorker and got some good press, but also Amelia Earhart is someone that doesn't need an introduction. So it's a really unusual opportunity for an author to go all over the United States and even outside, because how often do you get a subject for a narrative nonfiction or biography where everyone knows the person? But they all have questions. So it's been really engaging, but I'm very glad to be at this event as well, because I hope that some of the people that can't come see me on the road are with us in the Zoom room.
Oh, yeah, this has been quite something. I talked with a person from previous talks, and he mentioned our talk tonight, and he sent me a picture. There's a library in California named after Amelia Earhart.
I've actually been in that library.
Yeah,
I'm actually going to be doing a California tour, and I hope that's going to be one of my stops. If anyone wants to see where I'm going, it's very simple on my website, lauriegwenshapiro.com. There's a whole list of events, and they keep changing, they keep coming in. But this one was set a while back, and I'm just excited because also, there's a connection to Dearborn as well. I mean, Amelia went everywhere around the world, and whether you liked him or not, there was a connection to Henry Ford, who was connected to Byrd, who was connected to Lindbergh, and so it's all that period of time, then the late 20s, early 30s. And I just find American history just really fascinating, and I was really thrilled to be able to, at least in my opinion, add to the conversation with some facts that we didn't know about Amelia Earhart.
Oh, yes, your book is wonderful. And speaking of Ford Connection, I was watching the news over the weekend, and there was an air show local by, and they had a Ford Trimotor, and it had TAT on the side it's for Port Clinton, Ohio. And I was
Uh-huh.
wondering if that could have been part of the airlines, the one used by some of the airlines that
Right.
she
No,
helped.
and actually that sort of leads us to how if you would like to know how I got into this story, goes
Yeah,
directly from my experiences researching my last book, The Stowaway, which was in a book for adults, but apparently a lot of teenagers like it as well. But it was a book about a young man who jumped into the Hudson River and stowed away to be on what was then command under birds expedition
oh,
of of Antarctica, with Fisher was the publisher, and he started to make his name for himself. He wasn't the head of Putnam Books, which was a legendary publishing house, very genteel back then, but he was the nephew of George Haven Putnam. There's a lot of Putnams in this book. It gets a little confusing, so I kind of give a guide up front. And he was trying to show off and show that he could bring the publishing company into the next century. And one of the things that happened to Lindbergh and convinced him to publish with him. So I got very familiar with Putnam before I even started this Amelia Earhart book, because my last book, as I said, had a lot to do with Admiral Byrd and the expedition in 1928, which is exactly the year that Amelia Earhart comes on the scene. And in fact, in my last book, there's a moment where there's teenage stowaways on the Hudson River in New York, and flying over the Hudson River is Amelia Earhart in August of 28. She had just become famous in June of 28 for being the first female passenger across the Atlantic, not piloting that one yet. But she did have a book deal, which was the reason for that stunt, published by George Putnam. And that was really curious to me. I was I
your
kept
signal is cutting
thinking
out.
about that. Mental notes, Antarctic round. If I'm going to go into the next logical story, maybe you're hard in this time. Yeah. Hello. Oh, so anyhow, are you able to hear me?
Yeah, okay,
Yes, I can
that's
see you
better,
moving your
better.
head now.
Yeah, better. Yeah,
Okay. So I was just saying that with Amelia Earhart, let me know with thumbs up near me.
okay.
Are you able to,
Yeah,
I'm just curious if you're
you're cutting in and out.
okay. Um, okay. So with Amelia Earhart, let me know if I should go into another room at a certain time. We don't usually have the problem, but it's Zoom. Life happens.
Oh yeah,
Can you
yeah,
hear me?
definitely.
Okay. Are we okay for me to continue?
Yeah, let's try.
Okay. So the question that began this book for me was, there's a mystery that everyone focuses on in how did Amelia Earhart vanish? How did she die? But what began this book for me was, who was Amelia Earhart? I really didn't know that much about her. And I thought that was really interesting. I didn't know if she was a good pilot, if her later marriage to George Putnam, who had been her publisher, who was a married man when she met him and had an affair with him, if that was a real marriage. I didn't know if she had political leanings like Lindbergh. I didn't know anything. And I just thought, I'm going to do a deep dive and figure out who she actually is. So that was the story that began this book, to find out who she was for real, because a lot of biographers and nonfiction people sometimes work with the estate, the gatekeepers, and that's a terrible way to get out the truth because there's sort of a whitewashed narrative that comes aboard. I wasn't sure if I was going to love Amelia Earhart at the end of the book, and I will say up front before anyone gets nervous, I I did not I think that people will really love the Amelia Earhart in this book. But what's interesting is how you might not like her husband. But that's what makes an interesting narrative to me, is that there's really two Amelia Earharts in this story. There's an Amelia Earhart that before she meets George Putnam, and then everything changes in 1928 and her life goes in a completely different direction, and there's almost an Amelia Earhart created on West 45th Street in Manhattan, like with a media spin, and that's the Amelia Earhart, for better or worse, that inspires so many people for generations. And that Amelia Earhart comes about through her connection from 1928 to 1937, during her disappearance to George
You may have to move to a different
Putnam.
room.
So the book is The Aviator and the Show publishing in the Jazz Age.
Yeah, uh, if you paint a great picture, you paint all colors of it. It's a wonderful, wonderful picture of her. And I would be, as a librarian, I'm always curious about archives, and you apparently found very interesting ones. But I would almost, the first thing that comes to mind was, uh, would is Amelia kind of like the first reality show winner? Oh boy.
Well, I would say Amelia is in many ways the first influencer, um, if that makes any sense. She becomes famous in 1928, as I said, for being a passenger. And it really irks her that she is getting an incredible amount of attention. She didn't fly the plane that crossed the Atlantic. The people that flew the plane are forgotten to even to this day. She had a ticker tape parade. She had she was engaged to a gentleman named Sam Chapman, and George Putnam not only wanted to manage Amelia Earhart, he wanted to have a sexual relationship with Amelia Earhart, and he made her leave her relationship with Sam Chapman. uh, he really encouraged her to do it, and he promised her fortune and fame. And people say Amelia Earhart wasn't ambitious, but there's nothing wrong with a woman that's ambitious. And she did get eventually involved with Putnam, but the world changes just as the world is changing for us now. The big book really begins with the Jazz Age, with the end of the Jazz Age, not the early 20s with F. Scott Fitzgerald and the flapper era, but the era when people like Charles Lindbergh and Richard Byrd and Amelia Earhart Hart are the aviation stars. They are the gods, and they're drawing tremendous crowds. But of course, the world changes in 1929 with the stock market crash. And Putnam, George Putnam, or as he called himself, GP Putnam, um, was up to no good at all times. I mean, that's pretty documented in my book. One of the experiences in 1929 is he pretends that fascists are going to blow up Putnam books in New York, and and he's putting out letters and he's faked. This is the kind of entire life, including things like faking his own kidnapping. I mean, this is a little nutty, but Amelia is not the kind of person that's going to get herself into the press without a promoter. And in 1929, his uncle, who runs Putnam, is not thrilled with his antics. Really pushes him out of the company. His wife, remember, he was married, and he was married to the Crayola crayon heiress. She had a lot of money. She really didn't need, if you were the Crayola crayon heiress, you don't really need the husband so much. She got a new husband, and she kicks him out of the marriage. he tries to get back with her, but when the end of 1929 rolls around, Putnam is dead broke. And Amelia, who had actually made the equivalent of $1 million the summer of 28, is also scammed out of money. There's lots of stuff going on around the stock market crash. She has no money. So what began as a very passionate romantic relationship quickly turns into a calculated partnership on both of their parts. It's not like Amelia didn't know who George was. And how are we going to survive? Just the way that people are surviving the pandemic now. The story becomes about how are we going to make money, because they were what we call, I guess now, house rich, cash poor. They look good from the outside, but they really were completely broke. And one of the ways that Putnam and Earhart decided to make money together is by setting up lecture tours and charging fees, not dissimilar to what I'm doing, where I'm going around the country talking to people. I'm not charging people because I'm promoting my own book, but Amelia Earhart could command a pretty good fee. But in order to be wanted for these lectures, she had to do stunts that got her in the news. And the greatest stunt of all, which was something she actually wanted to do for feminist reasons as well, was to cross the Atlantic in 1932, which is a year after they got married, by herself, not as a passenger, to be what George would promote as the greatest woman pilot in the United States. The trouble was that she wasn't the greatest woman pilot. There were other women that were better. And one of the things in this book that's documented is how some of these women were bullied by George. Amelia doesn't appear in any of these records of bullying, and it's very hard to discern if it's a good cop, bad cop situation, or sometimes she doesn't know what George is up to. But there's a young woman named Eleanor Smith who is the greatest woman pilot. She's on the Wheaties box as a teenager. She is a fantastic pilot. There's another woman named Lady Heath from Ireland. And these are threats to Amelia being touted as the queen of aviation. And George will do anything he can to destroy their lives and livelihood and keep pushing Amelia Earhart to be in the news. And she's also taken a lot of stunt flying. So here's where it gets confusing for a reader, perhaps. That doesn't mean that Amelia Earhart is a bad person. She's very, very brave. She definitely wants to bring women up. That's something that really distinguishes herself from other women pilots, many who are just going for these records. They're not trying to bring other people up with them. But Amelia is always trying to bring women up. She's the first president of the 99s, which is the organization still to this day of women pilots. But she's also trying to push aviation, and she becomes quite valuable in the aviation industry. You mentioned TAT Airlines. She becomes basically the vice president of that with Lindbergh to push aviation out. Um, Amelia Earhart is very likable. Lindbergh, not so much. He's a heartthrob in the beginning, but he's not very easy with people. Amelia was very charming. And what she does is she starts to really try to convince women to take rides on airlines. She would take like 20 women up at a time. And what that means is that they'll let their husbands fly. And she's preaching that aviation is going to be safer than riding in a car and will get you there faster. And in many ways, when you take a plane today, when you get on a plane, that's because Amelia Earhart kept the aviation industry afloat. She was very much a team player. So again, her MO, the way I see it, is not so much to be the best woman pilot, but to be able to use a platform like an influencer to bring women up in aviation, to show that women can achieve things, and to also promote aviation itself without regardless of gender. Now,
Well,
what she
go ahead.
also is, she's brave, she's inspiring, but she's reckless. So she's very we have an unstable connection right now. Okay, she's very, very reckless. she's often flying above her ability, which is it's great if you make it, right? When the New Yorker promoted my excerpt of this book, they said this was a tragedy foretold, because from the very beginning, I'm trying to show that George, and even before he met Amelia Earhart, would take great risks with his authors, including kid explorers that he made sign over their life rights. The parents, they had no agency. Amelia was taking things like even that very first flight as a passenger in 1928. Most of the women who had even tried that to be a passenger had died. It was very dangerous, very reckless. And if you make it, you're golden. But if you don't make it, your life is over. And there were other women that took much more precaution. But anyone that could fly at that period of time was taking their life in their hands. I mean, that's hard. It's very important to say that. But she did not learn things like Morse code. She did not keep her radio skills up. She was not getting her time in the airplane. That doesn't mean she's a bad person, but this is just the reality, because she's on the road lecturing over 300 hours a day, which is keeping the Putnam Earhart household afloat, because it's Amelia's lectures that are keeping her name, keeping the income for the Putnams. And in order to be in the news, you have to take more stuff. You have to do more stunts. So this is what's so fascinating, is that you don't have to have her be the best pilot to still be brave. But I think people get sort of confused when I say she wasn't the world's greatest pilot. It's just the truth. But you had to be a pretty good pilot to get across the Atlantic by yourself. But again, she was headed for Paris, and she ended up in Ireland in a cow field. And some of the archives that I found, which took many years to locate, included 200 hours of audio tapes. Even people that were her friends, her fellow 99s, women pilots, that like Louise Thaden, whose name we don't know today because she didn't have a George Putnam in her life. She was along with Eleanor Smith, and Lady Heath, considered one of the greatest pilots. She won the famous Women's Air Derby, with which Keith O'Brien wrote about for a book called Fly Girls. Louise Thaden was an amazing pilot and very, very close to Amelia Earhart. And she was talking to her right up until she died, and did not want her to take this very last flight that she took, which we can talk about if you like. That 1937 flight is not a continuous, it's not a one flight. You're stopping along the equator. She's flying with a navigator named Fred Noonan. And this particular flight was not needed. It was set up by Putnam and Earhart to pay bills, to set up a retirement. It wasn't really to push aviation. So the entire flight was bankrolled. They were very, very broke. And there was a crash in the other direction, a ground looping on the ground. When she started to take off in March of 1937, they lost all their money, and the only way to make it back was to do the plane trip again, and to get all sorts of sponsorships. Safety wise, it was a disaster, because to get that little tiny island, I don't know how many people listening know about Amelia Earhart's disappearance, but she was flying at the end from Lae, New Guinea. She was headed towards Hawaii, with a stop at an island that's the size of Central Park. I'm a New York City kid, so those are my references. Very small. And everyone told her this is a suicide mission. Even her best friends, like Jackie Cochran, who was another great pilot, really went for the records. Louise Thaden, they're saying, you don't need to do this. You have a career. She's teaching at this point in Indiana as a consulting lecturer at Purdue University. But really, this was a money-making endeavor, and safety was in question, because not only did she not learn Morse code, but a lot of corners were cut in order to make this a book. This is always often driven by a book that would come out before Christmas. Fred Noonan, for those that don't know, he was a tremendous navigator. He worked for Pan Am. He used something called celestial navigation. He was considered he'd flown over the route many, many times, but he also came cheap because he was fired from Pan Am for being an alcoholic. And I'm not saying that he was drunk on the last flight, but he was definitely drunk 2 days before. And Amelia and Fred got into a big fight, which was talked about on tape by people that were in New Guinea. And these are the kind of things that searching out new archives that have not been kept away because of, we want to keep this story, clean, and we want to make her hero. I find that people who are imperfect make much more interesting stories. And Amelia Earhart, to me, is still a hero at the end of this book. But you start to see what's going on behind the scenes, and how this last flight was really something that she was not prepared for at all, including not having those radio skills that would have saved her life.
Well, it's very hard there was only so many limited avenues for women at that time. And getting pilot license, the men's had an advantage, like during World War I, pardon me, to get flying time. And there was only so many jobs that were limited for women. So it was hard. It was hard.
Amelia had already come to that conclusion, to be honest with you. She did have a license that she got in California around 1920 when she was at Columbia University in New York, a pre-med student. They didn't have women in the daytime program, but at the nighttime extension school they did. She was studying to be a doctor, and her parents were about to get a divorce. Her own father was an alcoholic, so alcoholism goes throughout this book. A lot to revolves around that. She decided she was going to go out to California for the summer and try to save her parents' marriage. They had moved there from the Midwest, and she started to learn how to fly. But there was some stunt flying available to her, but basically there was no money unless you were really taking your life in your hands. And she decides in the end, she had many, many jobs. She takes a ride with her mother. At the parents' marriage does not last, and the mother and the two daughters go east to Boston. And Amelia Earhart eventually gets a job as a social worker, a flying social worker who can do some promotion for the social work house, and a little bit of flying on hobby flying. But she was not going to be a pilot at this point. That wasn't where her livelihood was. She did want to count. She did have a scrapbook as a teenager of women heroes, and she was getting older. I mean, I'm in my late 50s, and it's funny when I say this, but she was 31, and that was very old in at this period of time. And,
Yeah.
and she wanted her life to count. So here comes this guy that says, "Hey, guess what? We'll pay for you to go across the Atlantic, and if you make it, you're going to inspire a lot of women." And it was a very reckless decision. She almost died on the flight. That pilot, Wilbur Stoltz, was actually an alcoholic himself, was extremely drunk when he took off. So, I mean, that flight, which George was pushing her to do before they were married, was already a reckless collaboration. But what she probably would have continued on with was social work. That was a way forward for women. Many of you would know that Frances Perkins was on FDR's inner circle, was on his cabinet. She was on his cabinet. That was a way forward for women. And she had come in as a underpaid social worker. Had very little money when she met Putnam. So you could see some of the appeal as well. But she was rising. She had gotten on the board of directors of the social work house in Boston. And if she had never met Putnam, she would have been someone who flies once in a while and was rising in social work. That's what I think would have happened. But she met Putnam and history changed.
Yeah, it was she made so much of a difference with uh, in, with women, to encourage them to fly, to encourage them to be in science. Uh, you have a
Absolutely.
you have a great anecdote where you talk about how she took Eleanor Roosevelt and others uh, for a ride after a dinner.
Y-
Uh,
Yeah, I mean that's actually right. And I think that that's the kind of story that can use a little bit of a second look. I hate bursting some bubbles. Like, there's even been a children's book where this was a impulsive move, and Eleanor and Amelia were talking and they're going to fly over Washington. Now, that happened. That flight really happened. And Eleanor was enthralled by aviation. In fact, she was trying to get her own um, license. Um, but that wasn't just random. George Putnam had set that up. He was a PR maverick. He knew, like, let's get the flights ready. Suddenly there's a plane ready and they're whisking, and if all these, what Eleanor Roosevelt famously used women reporters, would give them the story over men. And they had a wonderful scoop. They had Amelia Earhart in the air with Eleanor Roosevelt. So there's two there's something going on there that I think is really important for people to look at, that the story is technically true. Amelia Earhart and Eleanor Roosevelt were good friends and they did this flight. But was it a spontaneous moment? No. But that doesn't mean that we can't write the truth. And I think that's the thing that I think I try to stress on tour, and I'll do it here. I'm a journalism professor at NYU. I write for the New York Times. This book was excerpted in the New Yorker and had two fact checkers for 7 days, 14 hours a day. Viking Books is a reputable publisher and did put this through fact checking. I have to have the receipts for everything that I say. So I don't believe in making things up, even if it's not going to be what I want to read. I would have loved for that to be spontaneous, but you listen to archives, you listen to tapes, you look at letters, and you start to triangulate the truth, which is, yeah, they did that flight. But yeah, Putnam was sort of in the corner. It's sort of like, when she meets some of the celebrities, Putnam at this point got work with Paramount Pictures. And there's all these wonderful photos of Amelia Earhart with Cary Grant and Harpo Marx. I've even seen some own crazy conspiracy theories that Harpo Marx was her lover. And that was actually spread on the radio. But 15 feet away from that photo is Putnam, who's an executive at Paramount Pictures at this point. So, I mean, the truth is to me much more interesting than sort of an invented narrative. And I hope that by showing my receipts, with narrative nonfiction, it reads novelistically or like a HBO documentary cinematically, but your notes and your sources are at the back of your book. So what I've tried to do is say, okay, this happened, and you can look in the back. I don't have footnotes in the middle of each chapter. That's more of an academic style. I would hope that this book would appeal to people that read David Grann, who nicely blurbed this book, Patrick Radden Keefe, Susan Orlean, Candace Millard. They're storytellers. These are my heroes. And also people like Robert Caro are my heroes, where I went to 30 different cities over 5 years to research this. I didn't just rely on the narrative of other books that came before me. I fact checked authors who were considered experts that had got a lot of the story wrong. You got to not trust anyone. And there's a saying in journalism, if your mother says I love you, you got to fact check that. So that's sort of where I came into this as a journalist. Like, I didn't have any agenda except where the truth was going to lead me. And Amelia Earhart is not a terrible person at the end of this book. So don't get crushed. Nobody needs to get crushed. She's just a real person, a human person with ambition. She's sexual, she's confident, she's overconfident, she's brave, she can be lazy. All things can be true at the same time. But she's a real person.
well, like I said before, you paint her as a real person. It was very, very interesting because of it. You talk in the acknowledgments that you approached the different authors who have done biographies of her before. Uh,
Right.
and they, what were they apprehensive, or what were their kind
Yes.
of reactions?
I would be apprehensive, but I needed to know. I was coming at this book. I sold my proposal in um November of 2019. Right, it was right before the pandemic. A lot of my, the pandemic was part of my research time, but I did get a lot of my research done right away. I mean, that's one thing if anyone here is a nonfiction person, if you get a book deal, don't like just wait and spend that money and spend it on coffee, just an exotic coffee. You've got to get on that plane and use that money and get your research done, because time goes really fast when you're on a contract. um, but when I approached the other biographers, many of them had worked years before me, like in the 80s, early 90s. I also approached the people that worked on the American Experience documentary that was on PBS. I wanted to see what was left out, if that makes any sense. I'm also a documentary filmmaker. I know that you could have 100 hours and have 1 hour of footage. I wanted to know if anything like her sexuality or gender identity or anything about the marriage was left out, if anyone was pressuring people. And I found out a lot. I mean, what is not in a book or a film can often be just as interesting. But one thing I really did want to miss. I'm married to a man. I identify as heterosexual. I wouldn't care if Amelia had a different sexuality or gender identity, but I wanted to see if that was missed, if that was something that couldn't be said back then. Um, I can just tell you what I found, which is there were a lot of boyfriends that I found. That doesn't mean that, the gold standard in research is letters between people. Um, there could be things that appear later on, but I talked to a lot of people that even had interviewed people that knew Amelia Earhart, and I was just trying to see if there was something left out of the story, because times they are changing. Like what could we say in 2025 that we probably couldn't say in 1985? And I think they were very appreciative. Not everyone loves the idea that I am pretty blunt about George Putnam. Again, one of the mistakes that a lot of biographers make is working exclusively with an estate, because they're trying to work, you keep a very clean narrative. If you have someone really ugly in your past, you're going to soften the edges. And the same thing with Muriel, Amelia's sister. She was a very traditional woman. She was a teacher in Medford, Massachusetts. She wasn't that close to Amelia during the years that she was flying, which was very surprising to me. She didn't even meet George Putnam until after she disappeared. And George offered her money because she was quite broke from, she had a book deal. Can you give me something? That he had to finish that book when Amelia disappeared. Can you give me any stories from her childhood? That kind of thing. So she became quite useful to George Putnam. Amelia and her sister were close when they were kids, but not during that 10-year stretch when she's with George. And I think what was fascinating about that is that I did interview Muriel's daughter, who just died. I was the last person to interview her, and she was telling me that her mother would make up stories too, or not so much make it up, but smooth it out. She didn't want Amelia to look unseemly at any moment. And I'm quite the opposite. I'm like, people are not perfect. If Amelia's unseemly in a certain area, I put that on paper. And here's an example of that. Um, she did have a license, but what was really desired by women trying to show that they were the great pilots was what was called a transport license. And very falsely, George promoted that Amelia had the fourth transport license in America for a woman. She didn't. That was completely faked. And she didn't get that license until a year later. And there were women that were witnesses to her flying, and they were dismissed by previous biographers or historians as, oh, she's lying, she's jealous. But no, this is the truth. Amelia Earhart was flying false, like, she was being promoted as having a transport license. That doesn't mean that her whole life is canceled. She's still flying across the Atlantic. She's still inspiring women. She's doing, taking up feminist causes. But she's ambitious, and people do that all the time in the world. Men do that all the time. How do they cut corners to get ahead? And so I just put it in, warts and all. And I think for a smart reader, that they're not going to want a perfect version of a woman in American history. They're going to want the most real version that you can deliver. And of course, as anyone would tell you, there are things that can come out after my book that I didn't have access to, but I had access to a lot of stuff, 200 hours of tapes, files that I found in New Hampshire, files that I found in University of Iowa, places that no one had ever looked. I got a pretty good advance because I'm not, and it wasn't an academic publisher, it was Viking Penguin, but part of the reason you get a good advance on a nonfiction is so that you spend the money and do the research and can deliver a book that an academic might not be able to deliver because they're not getting that kind of money. So the second I got my first payment, I was off to the races. And much to my husband's chagrin, by the way, he felt all that money should go to the mortgage. I felt it should go to research.
What surprised, anything along the way surprised you?
Yes. Well, besides the transport license, I was shocked on audio tapes that I was the first to listen to find out that there's this whole story that Amelia left her and get her fiance, Sam Chapman, to choose Putnam, and that she saved up and got this sports car and went across the country. It's a really lovely story. But I was really shocked to find out that Sam Chapman was a real man and she was engaged to him, but there was another man she really wanted to marry when she was a young girl. And he was a very wealthy man who was in his 60s. And she brought him to her parents to ask for marriage. He had made a lot of money off of the bicycle craze in the 1890s and was the billboard king of California. And even though it's Amelia Earhart, she still had to ask for her parents' permission because, again, she was born in 1897. This is something that I've never seen. It just goes to show you that doesn't make her a bad person. How many women have married as a way to gain power, money, the ability to fulfill their dreams? Amelia was trying to do that in the 20s, and later on she marries George Putnam, who was very charming, very good looking. The kind of person who's very charming if you're a value to someone, and Amelia Earhart was a value to George Putnam, who married 4 times, by the way, all with very similar, what we call today, love bombing methods, like absolutely charming the socks off of every woman that he's trying to marry. He's funny, he's smart, he's literate. Um, but I found what I was shocked about was, again, this ambition. Amelia Earhart was taught, like many women are, including myself, I've been taught this, to downplay your ambition. People don't like ambitious women, but she was plenty ambitious. And I think that was something that really gave me a true sense of who she was. She was willing to take risks that were life threatening in order to actually change history. And one other thing that I would say was when she does marry George Putnam, he's divorced from his first wife. There's 2 young children, and she becomes a stepmother. And her kids, her stepkids, are on tape talking about Amelia Earhart. I never thought of Amelia Earhart as a mother, and I thought that was, and that she was quite loved by them, which is good to hear, right? You don't want to hear that she was the evil stepmother. They absolutely adored her. In fact, she taught one of her stepsons how to fly, and he was a hero during World War II. Um, and that's the other thing that we can't answer. What would have happened? She was a pacifist. She was anti-war. There's no way she was a spy. That's all just lies and propaganda. Um, but I think what was so fascinating is, what would have happened after Pearl Harbor? Would she have, joined the war efforts? She was a lifelong pacifist because she had volunteered after World War I in Toronto while on a student vacation. She visited her sister and just dropped out of her finishing school to help veterans of World War II that were in the hospital. And because of what she saw, like severed limbs and all sorts of issues, she was adamantly against war of any kind. And I don't really know what would have happened in 1941. We can't make it up. That's what narrative nonfiction is. You can tell a story, but you can't make it up. It's not historical fiction.
Uh, I want to show you something from the Henry Ford Museum uh, that is very close by to here. This is one of her the blouses that
Oh,
she
yes.
designed.
Yes. So this is from her that
From
she had an aviation line. Now this is something really interesting. One of the things to keep her in the news that George Putnam was doing was had promoted her as um a fashion designer. She was promoted, she had a big makeover. She was put in Vogue magazine and Vanity Fair, and she had a fashion line that was in Macy's shop, a dedicated Macy's shops, and also because she had a plane, she could fly to all the department stores across the country. Now, there's a lot been said about Amelia Earhart who had all these skills, but I have really sad news is she didn't really design these clothes. It's just as much as Kim Kardashian designed clothes, but she might have put input in, but I think it's really interesting that she really wanted to get on with her flying. So this is a really interesting, probably that dates to the 1933, right after people are starting to be less interested in her flight around the world. The Great Depression is absolutely devastating Americans at this point. It was bad in 29, it's really bad in 1933. And this was a way to get more money, get in the news. But she does actually kind of grow into this role as a fashion icon. And she had not been someone who paid attention to it before, but she's voted one of the most fashionable women in America. These shops are, tremendous promotions for her. And also, Putnam is pushing out a line of air luggage, which many of us know the Amelia Earhart suitcases. But these are all Putnam, 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 Putnam. And Amelia is a willing partner because it's desperate times. And, there's very famous people who were dead broke. And Putnam and Earhart were doing these things together, but she really wanted to get back to flying. She really caught the bug when she started to get her skills up, and she started to do more. She started to become a much better flyer. She did get her transport license, not in 1929 as promoted, but in 1930. And she started to, after she got skills from Bert Balkin, who actually appears in my Stowaway book. He was the person that flew Admiral Byrd over the South Pole. He's her new coach. She's getting coaching from a man named Paul Mance, who becomes her great coach up until the time that she disappears. Her skills are getting better, and she doesn't want to do things like the fashion. She doesn't want to do things like the suitcases. She wants to really get aviation time and get the hours that she was never able to have. Um, and so but what's going on is, as any student of American history knows, the darn Great Depression wasn't going away. I mean, I'm in my 50s. I had a father who was alive when I sold my book. He died during this book, but he was 100 years old. And he was telling me stories about my grandmother during the Great Depression on the Lower East Side of New York, where I'm zooming in from still. My family still lives there. Um, and my grandmother was out going out with an axe, trying to get any wood from old buildings that she could, just to keep her kids alive. I mean, we have forgotten how desperate it was during the Great Depression, and people that were famous did not want in the news that they were really in a bad way, and George and Amelia were in a very bad way.
Okay, well, it's time for questions,
Absolutely. I'm happy to take any questions.
both here in the auditorium. Go ahead.
Um, how did she choose Fred Noonan as a navigator?
Did you hear that?
The question, I'll repeat it for anyone who didn't hear it, was how did she choose Fred Noonan as a navigator? Originally, she did not choose Fred Noonan. Originally, she was flying the other way around the world in March of 1937, and her navigator was to be a man that she'd met in 1928 when she was coming back by ship on the Roosevelt named Harry Manning, who absolutely knew Morse code. What people don't know, which I reveal in my book, is that she was romantically involved with Harry Manning on that ship ride back, which did not please Putnam, who was obsessed with Amelia Earhart, although he was married. But they would talk about if she ever had an opportunity to fly across by herself, that he would help her navigate. She, from the very beginning in 1928, was very embarrassed that she didn't do any flying. So she started to think about flying herself. So Manning comes aboard, but the plane ground loops. There's a junior navigator that's brought on named Fred Noonan very quickly, almost like a day before that flight, because Amelia's friend Jackie Cochran did not trust Manning as a ship navigator to be able to do airplane navigating. Now, Noonan again was a Pan Am navigator, tremendously talented. He was the one training the staff on the tapes that I listened to, which no one had ever listened to. I listened to many tapes by people who were Pan Am employees. I listened to people that were in New Guinea with him drinking. He was alcoholic, and there's other archives at the Smithsonian with the wife of and the LA aviation editor, that he came cheaply. And that's an example of Putnam cutting corners, because he took over management of this flight around the world. So was Noonan a talented navigator? Absolutely, the best in the game. Was he an alcoholic? Absolutely. Did his alcoholism come into play at the end of this trip around the world? Yes. There are people talking about him having a massive fight with Amelia 2 days before. I don't think he was drunk when he got on that plane, by the way, because Amelia took him on a field trip to an indigenous town, almost to put eyeballs on him. And again, remember, her own father was an alcoholic. She never drank. She was really against alcohol, but she was again going across the Atlantic in 1928 on the Friendship. That was a man was an alcoholic, and here was her father was an alcoholic, and that's why they moved all over the United States, which is actually good for a book tour, because I'm doing a lecture in Chicago. That's where she went to high school. I did the Amelia Earhart Festival in Kansas, where she grew up. She also lived in Des Moines, and it's her father was a very smart lawyer, but he was an alcoholic and kept losing his job. So alcoholism and being a child of an alcoholic, you tend to put yourself in a private space. From what I've heard, my father was a non-drinker, but this is really interesting to me that Fred Noonan came cheap, and that's on a lot of archives that I discovered.
Okay, yes, ma'am.
Oh, that Earhart, but did you use her husband's name for anything?
Couldn't hear
Did
that.
did she use her husband's name in like everyday life? Like,
No. She was a very early champion of using her own name. What she felt, what they would say officially, was that when she did a record, that she would use Amelia Earhart, and occasionally she was Mrs. Putnam, but she didn't love it. And she's actually, there's a letter. I live in New York City. I did a lot of research at the New York Public Library, and there's a letter in their special archives where she writes to the New York Times, who was like, had sponsored her at the, one of her flights. So she had a relationship with the man, the Ox family. And she's saying, listen, in the New York Times, I know I saw your wedding announcement, but please, I want to be referred to as Amelia Earhart. And I find that very interesting, but that was not uncommon at that time, by the way. I mean, she was a feminist. She was a member of Alice's James organization. I don't know if anyone has seen the Broadway musical Suffs. Alice James was a very militant feminist organization. And Putnam, by 1925, partly because of Henry Ford, there was something called the Spider Charts, where feminism, which was fine in 1920, by 1925 was linked to socialism and communism. And there was also, it wasn't okay to say you were a feminist anymore. And she was told when she got in the public spotlight to tone down her connections to her feminist organizations, but it makes a lot of sense for her not to use her husband's name because of who she was. She didn't believe in it.
Okay. Questions? Whatever happened to Sam Chapman?
Oh, it's a very sad story. Sam Chapman lived in Marblehead, Massachusetts. He met Amelia in California. He was a chemical engineering student at Tufts in Massachusetts, and he went out to make his money. And Amelia Earhart's parents were living above their means because they finally got some money, and but they had to rent out some rooms, and one of the rooms they rented out to was Sam Chapman. He was pretty much in love with her. He was around her age. First, she's with this other gentleman who's in my book, the older man, but he gets thrown away by the parents. You can't marry our daughter. Sam, they put out an announcement in LA Times that I found that she's actually engaged. She's technically engaged to him for 7 years. I think he was really in love with her. He follows her back to Massachusetts. He meets with her even after she's met with Putnam. I mean, they stayed friends. He never remarries. And I just recently met someone who's been researching. I went to Marblehead. I visited his grave. I met descendants. I did a lot of research on this. But another researcher recently told me that she finally found his records, and he died by suicide in 1950. We don't know. It would be very romantic to say he never got over Amelia Earhart, right? But that would be making it up. We don't know why he killed himself, but he did. He never did have kids. He never did get married. But that's the tempted. That's what for historical fiction. That's not the stuff of nonfiction. You can just give the facts, and if you don't know it, you can't make it up.
Oh, that's sad because I liked the way you
Sam is a
portrayed
good
her life.
guy. I would have loved for her. Actually, I was going to do a piece about her. What would have happened if she went to Marblehead and she became a Marblehead wife, and she would have been very yachty. But that's like history unfolded as it did.
Okay, any more questions? Okay, final question. What is it about her that people still have some reference, being Amelia Earhart, have reference after all this time? Was it how she died? Was it, what do you think? What do you think?
I think we have, I first of all, I think she was a good person. I think that really comes across. I listened to 200 hours of tapes no one ever listened to of everyone that knew her. No one had a bad word to say about her. Everyone had a bad word to say about Putnam. It was the opposite. But as I said at the beginning of this, you do not get Amelia Earhart without Putnam. So he promoted the heck out of her. She was the most famous woman in the world in 1932 when she crossed the Atlantic. But unlike many people that achieve fame, she really tried to use her platform for good. Yes, she was trying to make money, but she would help other women pilots. She was trying to push women ahead. She was trying to push aviation ahead. There is a real authenticity about her that I think we can feel. But I think that we also have to realize that she was heavily promoted. And then, of course, what happens is that she was known in her lifetime for her achievement. When she disappears, people love a mystery, and it became a cottage industry. In the 60s, all these guys were coming up with nuttier and nuttier tales of how she disappeared. A lot of that was propaganda, and I hate to say some of that propaganda was put out by George Putnam when he was marrying a young woman and needed money, and he very well knew that Amelia Earhart, and by all accounts, ran out of gas, and he would placed sources. There was a movie called Flight for Freedom. This is all in the book, by the way. So if anybody wants the fuller picture of the story, I put it in, and there's 64 photos that are in the book. And one of the reasons I did that was because I wanted to show the stuff that I was talking about, not just with my notes, that people could see him faking his own kidnapping and all sorts of things like that. Also, if you are an audio, the book is also on Kindle, but if you're an audiobook person, I don't know how many people know Heart to Heart with Stephanie Powers, the 1970s movie. She's also a pilot, and she actually did the audiobook for The Aviator and the Showman. One of my great 1970s, 80s heroes, Stephanie Powers from Heart to Heart. She has an incredible voice, and she's really brought passion to the audio version, if that's your preference.
Oh, yeah, somebody like that could make a big difference. That makes a big
Absolutely.
difference in an audio
And she was
book.
also the girl from Uncle. I don't know how many people remember the man from Uncle, but there was a spin-off show called The Girl from Uncle, and that was
Yeah,
Stephanie Powers.
yeah. So thank you very much, Laurie. Thank you very much for your time. It was great talking with you. It's
It
a
was wonderful.
one
And I
of,
will say, what have you mentioned the book plates before, but Viking has given me these wonderful book plates, and if anybody wants to get the book, there's book plates there, or they can also reach out to me. My email is at my website. It's my actual email. I do read it.
yeah, definitely. If you want some book plates, my work email is dlodge@dearborn.gov. Get in touch with me and I'll drop it in the mail. So thank you very much. And good luck on your book, rest
All
of your
right.
book tour. And
Thank you for inviting me. What a pleasure this was.
thank you very much.
All right. Take care.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye.